Why you always miss red flags. Right now, there's someone much like you sitting alone, replaying moments they wish they could undo. These are the moments when all the signs were there. Clear as day, if only they'd been able to see them. A partner's sudden coldness, followed by overwhelming attention. A business associate who never quite answered direct questions. A friend whose concern always seemed to revolve back to their own needs. The red flags were waving, and yet somehow, they missed them entirely. You probably know this feeling. Not because you're naive or foolish, but because you're human. And your brain, that extraordinary, complex organ that has kept your species alive for millennia, occasionally works against your own best interests. There's a particular kind of pain in recognizing these missed warnings after the fact. A deep frustration that whispers, "How could I not see this coming?" The answer isn't that you're broken or lacking in judgment. The answer lies much deeper, in the very mechanisms of how your mind processes trust, danger, and the world around you. For decades, psychology has told us that trust is a choice, a rational decision we make about whether someone is trustworthy. But neuroscience has discovered something far more complicated and, frankly, far more forgiving of our mistakes. Your brain doesn't decide to trust in the way you might decide to wear a blue shirt instead of a red one. Trust is orchestrated by ancient systems designed to keep you alive. Systems that sometimes work beautifully and sometimes betray you spectacularly. This book exists because the statistics are staggering. Studies show that most people encounter red flags in relationships, whether romantic, professional, or personal, long before they consciously recognize them as warning signs. Even more striking, research on emotional attachment and decision-making reveals that intelligent, capable adults are often the most vulnerable to missing these signals, precisely because their minds work so well in other areas. The same cognitive skills that make you successful in your career can actually make you more susceptible to manipulation and deception when your emotions are engaged. The neuroscience behind why you miss red flags reveals something both humbling and empowering. Your amygdala, the part of your brain responsible for threat detection, operates largely outside your conscious awareness. It's sending signals constantly, flagging potential dangers based on patterns stored in your nervous system. But these signals compete with other drives. The need for connection, the desire to believe the best in people, the powerful chemicals like dopamine and oxytocin that flood your brain when you feel attraction or trust. When these systems work in harmony, you navigate the world with wisdom and discernment. When they're in conflict, you find yourself wondering how you missed what seems so obvious now. Throughout this audiobook, we're going to explore exactly why this happens. You'll understand how your brain's alarm system works, why it sometimes fails to alert you properly, and, most importantly, how you can retrain it to catch these warnings earlier. This isn't about becoming paranoid or mistrustful of everyone around you. It's about developing a kind of informed vigilance, a deeper literacy in reading the signals your body, emotions, and mind are constantly sending you. We'll start by looking at the science of red flags themselves, what they actually are, how they differ from mere incompatibility or personality quirks, and why certain warning signs are so often ignored. Then, we'll journey into the architecture of your brain, the amygdala and limbic system that detect threats, the prefrontal cortex that should govern rational decision-making, and the spaces between where they often fail to communicate effectively. You'll learn about System 1 and System 2 thinking, the difference between fast, intuitive reactions and slow, analytical reasoning, and why we tend to make crucial life decisions using the wrong one. But this book goes deeper than just explanation. We'll examine the neurochemistry of attachment and how manipulators exploit it, often without even knowing they're doing so. you'll discover why love bombing feels so real, why traumatic bonding is so powerful, and why leaving someone who makes you feel simultaneously safe and terrified is one of the hardest things the human brain can undertake. We'll look at the specific strategies people use to bypass your natural defenses, and more importantly, how you can strengthen those defenses so they work for you instead of against you. In the middle of this book, we'll transition from understanding the problem to implementing solutions. Practical, actionable techniques based on how your brain actually functions will give you tools to use immediately. These aren't vague suggestions about trusting your gut or listening to your intuition. They're concrete practices drawn from neuroscience research that help your conscious mind access the wisdom of your unconscious systems. So the two work together instead of at cross purposes. We'll also explore real stories, not the sanitized versions from therapy cases, but the messy, complicated ways that real people missed red flags and what changed for them. These aren't stories of people who are different from you in kind, only in degree. They're stories of intelligent, capable adults who found themselves in situations they didn't expect and who ultimately learned to navigate their own psychology more skillfully. Their experiences will illuminate your own, and their insights might just prevent you from repeating patterns that no longer serve you. This work is especially important if you're in your 40s or beyond. By this point in your life, you've accumulated wisdom, experience, and often a deep weariness that comes from having made mistakes before. You might wonder whether it's worth learning to read red flags more effectively at this stage of your life. The answer is an emphatic yes. The patterns that drew you to certain kinds of people in your 20s don't automatically disappear with age. They often deepen, become more entrenched, precisely because you're not consciously examining them. But they also become more changeable in your 40s and beyond because you now have something you didn't have then: the ability to observe your own patterns with compassion rather than judgment, and the neuroplasticity to rewire them if you choose. The goal of this book isn't to make you afraid of other people or to convince you that everyone has hidden motives. Trust is essential for human flourishing, and many people are genuinely trustworthy. But discernment, the ability to distinguish between those who are trustworthy and those who aren't, between genuine red flags and simple personality differences, is equally essential. This is what we're cultivating together. As you move through this audiobook, you'll notice that certain themes emerge repeatedly, just as they do in life itself. This is intentional. Neurologically, your brain learns through repetition and layering of information, especially when that information connects to your emotions and experiences. Each chapter builds on the last, deepening your understanding and giving you multiple angles from which to view the same truths. But reading, or in this case, listening, isn't enough. You'll notice that at the end of several chapters, there are specific practices or challenges. These aren't optional add-ons. They're essential to the transformation this book promises. Your brain doesn't change simply because you've been exposed to information. It changes because you practice new ways of thinking, new patterns of perception, and new responses to situations that previously caught you off guard. These challenges will ask you to observe your own mind in action, to notice patterns you've never paid attention to before, and to take small, concrete steps toward different choices. Here's what I know about you if you're listening to this. You've probably been here before. You've probably recognized red flags too late, missed warnings, or wondered why you didn't see something coming that now seems blindingly obvious. You might be reading this because you're trying to protect yourself from repeating the same patterns, or because you're trying to understand what happened in a relationship or situation that left you hurt and confused. You might even be reading this because you're suspicious that you have a pattern of missing red flags and you want to understand why. All of these are valid reasons, and all of them are welcome here. This isn't about blame or shame. It's about understanding, growth, and the beautiful, frustrating reality of being human. Your brain did the best it could with the resources it had at the time. Now let's give it better resources. Let's understand how your mind actually works so you can work with it instead of against it. Let's strengthen the very real, very trainable capacity you have to recognize danger before it becomes a crisis. The neuroscience is clear. You're not incapable of seeing red flags. You're not broken, and you're not damaged. You're simply working with a brain that evolved to prioritize connection and trust over caution, often at exactly the times when a little more caution would serve you well. That's not a flaw. That's your humanity. But it's also something you can understand, work with, and ultimately master. Are you ready to understand why you miss the signals that matter? Are you prepared to explore the deepest parts of how your mind makes decisions about trust, safety, and connection? This audiobook is an invitation to do something that most people never do. To get curious about your own psychology in real time, to honor both your capacity for trust and your need for protection, and to emerge with a clearer picture of who you are and what you actually need. And one more thing. The patterns your brain has built can shift faster than you might expect. And the sooner you start understanding them, the sooner you can begin choosing differently. Chapter 1. Understanding red flags. A red flag exists in that peculiar space between a feeling and a fact. It's not quite a certainty, yet it's more than an intuition. When someone appears warm and attentive in the early stages of a relationship, only to withdraw completely when challenged with a simple question, something registers in the nervous system. When a business associate consistently fails to follow through on commitments but offers elaborate explanations each time, a signal fires. When a friend's concern always seems to circle back to what they need from the relationship, a shift occurs in how the situation is perceived. These moments, these impressions, are red flags. But what precisely is a red flag? It's not simply incompatibility. Two people can be fundamentally different in their values, temperaments, or life goals, mismatched in ways that make a relationship untenable, without either person displaying red flags. Incompatibility is neutral. It means they want different things, move at different speeds, or have conflicting visions for their lives. Red flags are something else entirely. They are behavioral patterns, communication styles, or emotional responses that suggest a person may be unsafe, untrustworthy, or fundamentally misaligned with the kind of relationship or interaction that would be healthy and sustainable. A red flag often carries with it a subtle dishonesty. It might be a lie of omission, a carefully curated version of events, or a pattern of saying one thing while doing another. It might be an attempt to control, subtle at first, barely noticeable, but present nonetheless. It could be an inability or unwillingness to take responsibility for one's own actions, always finding external explanations for internal failures. Red flags frequently involve some form of boundary violation, pushing for intimacy faster than is comfortable, sharing information that should have been kept private, or testing the boundaries of what another person will tolerate. What makes red flags different from simple personality quirks or relationship difficulties is that they typically predict future harm. They are not random glitches in an otherwise functional relationship. They are patterns. They repeat. They escalate. And they do so in predictable ways once noticed, yet so many people fail to notice them at the time they occur. The question then becomes, why? Why does a pattern of behavior that seems so clear in retrospect remain invisible when it's happening? Why do people often recognize red flags only after significant emotional or financial damage has occurred? The answer requires an understanding of how the brain processes information, how emotions shape perception, and how the very architecture of human consciousness sometimes works against our best interests. Red flags manifest differently depending on the context of the relationship, though the underlying mechanisms remain the same. In romantic relationships, red flags often involve control, manipulation, or dishonesty masked as care. Someone might monitor their partner's social media interactions or insist on knowing their location at all times, framing it as protection. Another might recount past relationships in a way that positions their previous partners as entirely at fault, demonstrating a pattern of blame shifting that will eventually extend to the current partner. Still another might employ intermittent kindness and cruelty, periods of extraordinary attention followed by cold withdrawal, creating a cycle of confusion and hope that the brain finds difficult to resist. In professional relationships, red flags typically involve trust and reliability. A supervisor who promises promotions based on personal loyalty rather than merit is displaying a red flag. A colleague who takes credit for others' work while quietly undermining their efforts is showing a pattern that, if ignored, will create a hostile work environment. A business partner who hides financial information or makes unilateral decisions despite agreements otherwise is demonstrating a fundamental disrespect for boundaries and shared power. In friendships, red flags often involve emotional labor imbalances and a lack of genuine reciprocity. One person consistently requires emotional support, crisis intervention, or assistance, yet is never available when the other person needs support. Another friend might engage in gossip about mutual acquaintances, creating an alliance built on shared negativity rather than genuine connection, which typically means they're gossiping about you to others as well. Someone might create drama around themselves repeatedly, drawing energy and attention from the friendship while offering little in return. Family relationships present a unique challenge because red flags here often come wrapped in obligation, history, and biological connection. A parent might use guilt as a primary motivator, insisting that their adult child prioritize their needs above their own well-being. A sibling might consistently violate confidences or create embarrassment through public stories. An extended family member might overstep boundaries repeatedly, offering unsolicited advice, criticism, or judgment under the guise of family concern. What unites all these contexts is the fundamental violation. Someone is prioritizing their own needs, desires, or narratives over honesty, fairness, or genuine concern for the other person. The red flag is the visible manifestation of this misalignment. The reason red flags so often go unnoticed is not stupidity or naivety. It is far more subtle than that. Human perception is not a camera that captures reality objectively. It is a deeply subjective, neurologically mediated process that is constantly shaped by emotion, history, need, and expectation. The same behavior that would register as a glaring red flag in one context might appear entirely innocuous in another, depending on who is observing it and what they need to be true. Consider a person who meets someone new. There is, at that initial moment, an openness to possibility. The brain is in a state of curiosity and interest. There are few reference points with this new person. Perhaps they remind us of someone we loved, or they possess a quality we've always admired, or they simply show interest in us at a time when we're feeling unseen. In this state, minor inconsistencies, the quick flash of anger that disappears, the story that doesn't quite add up, the way they become slightly defensive when asked about their past, can easily be reframed. Perhaps they were just having a bad day. Perhaps they misunderstood the question. Perhaps we're being judgmental, and we need to be more open-minded. This reframing is not a conscious choice. It happens automatically. The brain is constantly engaged in something called cognitive dissonance reduction, the process of reconciling conflicting pieces of information. When the positive impression we want to hold about someone conflicts with a behavior that might suggest danger or unsuitability, the brain often resolves this conflict by minimizing or reinterpreting the concerning behavior, rather than reconsidering our impression of the person. Additionally, red flags often emerge gradually. Rarely does someone present themselves as an unambiguous threat on the first meeting. More commonly, the problematic behavior begins subtly, presented in a way that has some plausible explanation. Over time, the behavior intensifies, but because the change is gradual, the person experiencing it adjusts their baseline expectations accordingly. This is sometimes called the boiling frog phenomenon. The idea that a frog placed in gradually heating water will not jump out as it would if placed in already hot water, because the change is too incremental to trigger the escape response. Similarly, in human relationships, someone might not recognize the cumulative impact of escalating boundary violations or manipulations if each individual instance can be explained away or is only slightly worse than the previous one. Missing red flags carries a real cost. It is not a matter of being overly sensitive or suspicious. Rather, it is a matter of personal agency and self-protection. Every time a red flag is missed, it typically results in one of several outcomes. Sometimes, nothing happens. The relationship ends for other reasons, or the person in question eventually leaves, and the red flags never materialize into real harm. But more often, missing red flags results in accumulated damage. In romantic relationships, ignoring warning signs often leads to emotional trauma, financial loss, or in severe cases, physical danger. Even in milder cases, years might be spent in a relationship characterized by emotional neglect, subtle manipulation, or profound misalignment that erodes the self-esteem and emotional well-being of the person who overlooked the initial warnings. In professional contexts, missing red flags in leadership or in business partnerships can result in career damage, financial loss, or an unhealthy work environment. Someone who fails to notice that their supervisor is interested in personal loyalty over merit might find themselves passed over for promotions despite strong performance. Someone who doesn't recognize manipulative business practices early might find themselves legally implicated in unethical conduct. In all contexts, there is a secondary cost, the opportunity cost. Time spent in relationships or situations that do not serve the person's growth and well-being is time not spent building connections or pursuing opportunities that would. Energy expended managing red flag behaviors, the emotional labor of constantly reframing, hoping for change, or managing the emotional volatility of another person, is energy that could be invested in personal development, meaningful work, or genuinely supportive relationships. One of the most confusing aspects of red flag recognition is that context matters profoundly. The same behavior that is a major red flag in one situation might be entirely understandable in another. A person who is guarded about their past might be displaying healthy boundaries after previous betrayal, or they might be hiding something significant. The same behavior has different meanings depending on the person, the relationship, and the circumstances. This is why blanket statements about red flags, "Never date someone who does X," or "Always watch out for Y," can be misleading. Context is essential. However, what remains consistent across contexts is the underlying dynamic. Is the person being deceptive or evasive? Are they respecting boundaries or violating them? Are they taking responsibility for their own actions or consistently blaming external circumstances? Do they show genuine concern for the other person's well-being and experience? Or is the relationship primarily structured around meeting their own needs? These questions help navigate the gray areas where simple rules fail. A person who is quiet about their past might be private and cautious, or they might be hiding significant information. The way to discern the difference is to observe whether they are willing to be vulnerable over time, whether they show genuine curiosity about understanding the other person, and whether their actions align with their words. Here is where neuroscience enters the picture. The brain has multiple systems for detecting threats and evaluating trustworthiness, and these systems do not always communicate efficiently. There is the amygdala, which makes quick threat assessments based on pattern recognition and emotional associations. There is the prefrontal cortex, which evaluates information more carefully and deliberately. There is the body's nervous system, which picks up on subtle cues of danger or safety through thousands of microsignals. Under ideal circumstances, these systems work together to provide a comprehensive assessment of a situation. But under many of the conditions that characterize the early stages of relationships, when emotional arousal is high, when there is a powerful motivation to see the other person in a positive light, when the nervous system has been trained by past experiences to dismiss its own warning signs, these systems can become misaligned. The result is that people miss red flags not because they are incapable of perceiving them, but because their brains are processing the information in ways that systematically obscure or minimize the significance of the warnings. Understanding this is the key to change. It is not about becoming more paranoid or distrustful. It is about understanding how the brain works so it can be engaged in service of true self-protection, rather than working against it. Chapter 2. Your brain's alarm system. Why it's silent. There is a fundamental misconception about why people miss red flags. Many believe that the warning system simply doesn't exist, or that some people are naturally blind to danger. This is incorrect. The system exists. It works. It is sophisticated and ancient and remarkably accurate. The real problem is far more subtle and, once understood, far more forgivable. The system is working perfectly. The problem is that no one is listening. Imagine a state-of-the-art security system installed in a house. The sensors are flawless. They detect movement, temperature changes, the smallest intrusion. The alarm goes off at the first sign of danger. But here is the catch. The person living in the house has learned to ignore the alarm. Sometimes they disable it entirely. Other times they hear it and dismiss it, convinced they are overreacting. Sometimes they hear it, but are so distracted by something pleasant happening upstairs that they simply cannot bring themselves to investigate the basement where the alarm is sounding. This is not a failure of the security system. This is a failure of attention and belief. The amygdala is this security system. It is your brain's ancient alarm, and it is detecting red flags all the time. When someone's facial expression flickers in a way that contradicts their words, the amygdala notices. When the tone of someone's voice shifts subtly, suggesting anger beneath sweetness, the amygdala registers it. When someone's body language reveals discomfort or deception, the amygdala has already noted it and is sending signals up through the brain to the conscious mind. But here is where the story becomes complicated. This signal arrives at consciousness already competing against other signals, other voices in the brain that are far louder and more persuasive. Consider what happens when someone attractive walks into a room, or when someone offers unexpected warmth and attention after a long period of loneliness, or when someone suggests the possibility of a deep and meaningful connection that has been missing from life. In these moments, the reward centers of the brain light up. Dopamine floods through the neural pathways. the brain enters a state of what might be called addiction to possibility. It is not metaphorical, it is neurochemical. This chemical state literally changes how signals are processed. The amygdala is sending its messages, but they are being filtered through a brain that has been flooded with a substance designed to override caution and promote trust and bonding. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for rational decision-making and the verification of threats, becomes less active during states of emotional arousal. Blood flow decreases to this region. The neural pathways that would normally allow the conscious mind to carefully evaluate the amygdala's warning become less functional. It is as though the house's alarm is ringing, but the owner has wandered away from the control panel and cannot see the warning lights anymore. This is not a personal failure. This is biology. This is evolution at work. The brain developed this system for a reason. If humans remained in a state of constant vigilance and skepticism, if the reward circuits were never allowed to override the threat detection system, pair bonding would be nearly impossible. Reproduction would be compromised. The species would not survive. So the brain includes this feature. Under certain conditions, particularly when attraction and hope are present, the system that protects you becomes less dominant than the system that draws you toward connection. But human relationships and human deception have evolved far beyond what the amygdala's ancient programming was designed to detect. A predator in ancestral times was obvious. A strange animal, an unfamiliar person from a rival tribe, something that looked wrong or moved wrong. Modern manipulation is far more subtle. It wears a smile. It offers reassurance. It delivers exactly what the person needs to hear and exactly what the person needs to feel. The manipulator understands, often instinctively, how to feed the dopamine system while simultaneously quieting the amygdala's warnings. Consider a common pattern. Early in an interaction, someone displays what is sometimes called love bombing. They are exceptionally attentive, giving compliments and attention and affection in quantities that seem too good to be true. Because the amygdala has learned from experience that such generosity can be dangerous, it sends out a small warning. Something in the back of the mind registers. This is too much too fast. But the dopamine response is so overwhelming that the conscious mind reinterprets this warning. Rather than seeing it as a sign of danger, the mind reframes it as evidence of deep and genuine connection. This person really cares. That is why they are being so attentive. My skepticism is wrong. I need to let my guard down. The amygdala registered the flag correctly, but the dopamine system won the argument. What compounds this problem is the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance. The human mind deeply resists contradiction. If someone believes themselves to be a good judge of character, or intelligent, or capable of seeing through manipulation, then when evidence suggests they are being manipulated, the mind will work very hard to reinterpret that evidence rather than accept the contradiction. It is easier for the mind to tell itself, I am misunderstanding the situation. This person is not being deceptive. I am being paranoid, than to say, I made a mistake. I misjudged this person. The amygdala may be screaming warnings, but the conscious mind is so committed to a particular narrative that it drowns out the screams. Additionally, many people have learned through past experience to distrust their amygdala. If someone grew up in an environment where manipulation and control were normalized, their amygdala has been trained to not respond to these threats. The system was essentially recalibrated during childhood. Someone whose parent was verbally abusive but claimed it was love will have an amygdala that does not register verbal abuse as dangerous. The warning system is there, but it was trained not to alarm. Years later, When this person encounters a partner who is similarly verbally abusive, the amygdala does not send a strong warning. It has learned to expect this. It has learned that this is normal. Then there is the factor of loneliness and emotional depletion. When someone has been without genuine connection for an extended period, their nervous system becomes primed to accept almost any form of attention as connection. The amygdala's threshold for threat detection actually rises. Put differently, it takes a much bigger red flag to trigger an alarm in someone who is desperate for connection. The brain is saying, "I need this more than I need to be safe right now." This is not weakness. This is neurobiology meeting survival desperation. Lastly, there is the matter of gradual escalation. Red flags rarely appear all at once. More commonly, they appear incrementally. The first time someone is dismissive, it can be explained. The second time, perhaps they were having a bad day. By the 30th time, the person has adjusted their expectations and accepted that this is normal. The nervous system adapts to each small shift. By the time the behavior has become obviously problematic, the person is so accustomed to it that the amygdala no longer registers it as alarming. This is the boiling frog phenomenon. The slow increase in temperature means the frog never jumps out because it has gradually adapted to each degree of change. The amygdala is not failing. It is receiving interference from 6 different directions at once. The dopamine system is overwhelming it. Cognitive dissonance is reframing its signals. Past trauma has recalibrated it. Loneliness is raising its threshold. Gradual escalation has normalized the danger. And finally, the conscious mind's need to believe a particular narrative about itself and about the other person is drowning out the amygdala's voice. What this means is that feeling a vague sense of unease, a tiny voice saying something is wrong, a physical sensation in the gut suggesting caution. These are real. The amygdala is often right, but these signals are so quiet compared to the noise of dopamine, hope, need, and self-deception that they can seem almost inaudible. The job ahead is not to develop a new warning system. It is to amplify the signal that already exists and to create space where that signal can be heard over the noise of everything else. Chapter 3. System 1 and System 2. Fast thinking hijacks, slow thinking. There are 2 fundamentally different ways the brain makes decisions. One is fast, intuitive, emotional, and automatic. It happens beneath consciousness and requires almost no effort. The other is slow, deliberate, analytical, and requires focused attention. Most people are not aware they have these 2 systems. Most people believe they make decisions through reason and logic. In reality, most people make decisions through the first system and then use the second system to justify what the first system has already decided. The psychologist Daniel Kahneman famously called these System 1 and System 2 thinking. System 1 is the brain's fast lane. It processes information instantly, based on patterns, emotions, and what is called gut instinct. System 1 is brilliant at pattern recognition. It has evolved to make quick judgments in situations where hesitation could be dangerous. In ancestral environments, if someone saw a movement in the tall grass, they did not have time to consider multiple hypotheses and weigh evidence. The System 1 brain said predator, and the person moved. If it turned out to be a deer, no harm done. If it actually was a predator and the person had stopped to think, they would be dead. System 1 evolved to be fast and erring on the side of caution. System 2 is the brain's slow lane. It is the seat of conscious reasoning, logic, mathematics, and deliberate analysis. System 2 can consider multiple possibilities. It can weigh evidence carefully. It can change its mind based on new information. System 2 is powerful, but it is also lazy. it requires energy and effort. The brain prefers to operate on System 1 whenever possible because System 1 is efficient. When System 1 can handle a situation, the brain will let it. Only when System 1 is uncertain or overwhelmed does System 2 step in. Here is where the problem emerges in the context of missing red flags. In early attraction, when someone is feeling arousal or hope or the possibility of deep connection, the brain enters a state of high emotional activation. In this state, System 1 is dominant. It is running the show. The person feels what they feel. They want what they want. They move toward the object of attraction almost automatically. System 2 is still there, but it is less active. The energy that would normally go to careful analysis is being redirected toward emotional processing. Moreover, System 2 is not neutral. It is not purely rational. System 2 is also subject to bias, particularly the bias of justifying decisions that System 1 has already made. Research shows that when people make decisions based on emotion or intuition, they then use System 2 reasoning to construct logical-sounding arguments for why their intuitive choice was actually the right one. The person feels drawn to someone, so System 2 constructs a narrative. I feel this way because this person is genuinely trustworthy and kind, and that is a reasonable basis for feeling drawn to them. What System 2 does not do is ask the harder question, could I be misinterpreting this person? Could my feeling be based on manipulative behaviors designed to make me feel this way? This is called cognitive dissonance reduction. When there is a conflict between what the person wants to believe and what the evidence suggests, the person will work very hard to reduce that conflict by reinterpreting the evidence. The person does not do this consciously. It happens automatically. System 2 reasoning gets co-opted in service of emotional comfort rather than truth-seeking. Consider a concrete example. Someone begins dating a new partner. On the first date, the partner is extremely attentive and flattering. There is something slightly inauthentic about it. The compliments come too easily. The attention feels a bit manufactured. But the person attributes this to nervousness or genuine enthusiasm. System 1 is processing the flattery as positive. System 2 is constructing a narrative. This person is just enthusiastic and open. 3 weeks in, the partner cancels plans twice without much explanation. This is concerning. The amygdala sends a small warning. But the person has already invested time and emotion. They have already told their friends about this person. They have already started imagining a future. System 1, which wants to preserve the reward state of new attraction, minimizes the significance of the cancellations. System 2 then constructs rationalizations. Everyone is flaky sometimes. I should not be so judgmental. Maybe they had real reasons they did not want to discuss. 2 months in, the partner becomes occasionally withdrawn and cold. When asked about it, they deny anything is wrong and then change the subject. This is another red flag. But at this point, the person has been bonded to the positive feelings of early attraction for long enough that their System 1 is deeply committed to the narrative that this is a good person in a good relationship. When System 2 processing would normally kick in and say, wait, this is strange behavior that warrants careful examination. Instead, System 2 says, I am probably being oversensitive. I should trust them. They have given me no reason not to trust them. But the person's own amygdala and body had been sending warning signals all along. System 2 simply reinterpreted those signals as personal faults rather than accurate perceptions. The reason System 2 thinking is so important in relationships is because attraction and emotional arousal literally change the physiology of the brain. Brain imaging studies show that when someone is in love or in early attraction, the prefrontal cortex, The brain region where System 2 thinking happens shows reduced activity. Blood flow decreases to this region. The neural pathways that would normally be available for careful analysis become less active. It is not that the person is incapable of System 2 thinking. It is that the brain's normal resource allocation has shifted. The energy and blood flow that would normally go to analysis are instead going to emotional processing and reward centers. Furthermore, System 1 thinking in the context of attraction tends to activate what researchers call the romantic idealization bias. The brain, operating on System 1, wants to see the best in the object of attraction. There is a powerful drive toward coherence between the image one has created and new information that comes in. When new information contradicts the idealized image, System 1 does not easily accept it. Instead, System 1 looks for ways to fit the new information into the existing image. A lie becomes, "He was just trying to protect my feelings." Inconsistent behavior becomes, "She is going through something, and when she feels better, she will be more stable." Manipulation becomes, "He just cares so much that he sometimes goes about it the wrong way." What makes this process particularly insidious is that the person is not aware it is happening. They believe they are thinking carefully. They believe they are using reason and logic. They do not realize that System 2 has been recruited to serve System 1's emotional agenda. They do not recognize that their reasoning is post hoc justification for intuitive choices they have already made. Additionally, there is a phenomenon called belief perseverance. Once someone has formed a belief about another person, particularly if they have publicly stated that belief or acted on it, they become resistant to evidence that contradicts it. If someone has told their friends that their new partner is amazing, if they have moved in with this person or made plans with them, they have invested social capital and emotional capital in the belief that this is a good person. When evidence emerges that contradicts this, the mind strongly resists updating the belief because updating the belief would require admitting that they were wrong. And updating the belief would mean acknowledging that they made a poor judgment, which contradicts their self-image as someone who is capable and perceptive. System 2 reasoning, deployed properly, would be the mechanism to catch red flags. System 2 can ask hard questions. System 2 can notice inconsistencies. System 2 can say, "I feel drawn to this person. But there are behaviors here that do not align with trustworthiness, and I need to investigate rather than rationalize." But System 2 only operates this way if it is given permission to. If System 1 has decided to move forward, if emotion has gained dominance, then System 2 becomes subservient to System 1's agenda. The role of intentional thinking, deliberately choosing to use System 2 even when System 1 wants to operate on its own, is crucial. This is essentially what slowing down means. It means interrupting the automatic processes and saying, "Wait, let me think about this carefully. Let me notice the inconsistencies rather than rationalizing them away. Let me ask questions rather than accepting answers." It means temporarily disengaging from the emotional reward of the attraction and applying analytical distance to what is actually happening. This is difficult. It goes against the brain's natural inclination. When someone is in a state of attraction or emotional arousal, deliberately engaging System 2 requires effort and intention. It requires saying no to the rewards the brain is offering. It requires being willing to see things that might be uncomfortable to see. But this is precisely the intervention point. This is where the amygdala's quiet warnings can be amplified and heard. This is where red flags can shift from background noise to foreground attention. Chapter 4. The Neurochemistry of Attraction. How your brain gets hijacked. To understand why people miss red flags, It is necessary to understand the biochemistry of what happens in the brain when attraction begins. This is not poetry or philosophy. This is chemistry. And when you understand the chemistry, you understand why the alarm system goes quiet. When someone first encounters an attractive or compelling person, something very specific happens in the brain. It is not voluntary. It cannot be stopped through willpower or rationality. The brain releases a cascade of neurochemicals designed to create a state of attraction and bonding. Understanding these chemicals, what they do when they are released, and how they affect perception, is crucial to understanding why red flags become invisible. The first and most famous of these chemicals is dopamine. Dopamine is not the pleasure chemical, as many people believe. Dopamine is the wanting chemical. It is the chemical of motivation and desire. When dopamine is released, the brain becomes focused on obtaining whatever it is dopamine has been released in response to. In ancestral times, dopamine was released in response to food or potential mates or things necessary for survival. In the modern brain, dopamine is released in response to anything that suggests possibility and reward. When someone attractive walks into a room, when someone offers unexpected attention and affection, when someone suggests the possibility of a deep and meaningful connection, dopamine floods into the reward centers of the brain. Here is what dopamine does. It narrows focus. It increases motivation. It makes the target of dopamine release seem more valuable and more important. It makes waiting feel unbearable. It makes you crave the presence of the person who triggered the dopamine response. It also does something very specific to perception. It makes the brain see what it expects and wants to see. And it diminishes the perception of things that contradict the desired narrative. In other words, dopamine is chemically inducing the exact blindness that the introduction promised to explain. When someone is experiencing high dopamine in response to a new person, their brain is essentially in a state of temporary addiction. The person's perception is not objective. The brain is not interested in objective truth. The brain is interested in obtaining more of the dopamine reward. If seeing red flags would threaten the dopamine reward, the brain simply does not see them as clearly. If a behavior is ambiguous, could be interpreted as caring or could be interpreted as controlling, the dopamine-saturated brain interprets it as caring because that maintains the reward. But dopamine is not the only chemical involved in the story. Early attraction also triggers the release of oxytocin. Oxytocin is sometimes called the bonding chemical or the love hormone. It is released through physical touch, through eye contact, through certain types of intimate conversation. Oxytocin creates a sense of safety and trust. It bonds people together. In normal relationships with genuinely trustworthy partners, oxytocin is wonderful. It creates the glue that holds partnerships together. But oxytocin can be deliberately triggered and manipulated. An astute manipulator understands that certain types of attention, certain patterns of eye contact, certain forms of physical affection trigger oxytocin release. They can manufacture oxytocin in their target by being strategically attentive and physically affectionate. What oxytocin does is increase trust and decrease skepticism. When oxytocin is present, the person is more likely to believe what they are told. They are more likely to overlook inconsistencies. They are more likely to interpret ambiguous behavior charitably. In essence, oxytocin is a chemical that says to the brain, "This person is safe. They are on your team. Do not scrutinize them too carefully." This is the neurochemical basis for why people often say after leaving a manipulative relationship, "I cannot believe I did not see that. It was so obvious." The answer is oxytocin. The manipulator created a state of artificial trust through deliberate triggering of oxytocin release. Then there is cortisol, the stress hormone. When someone is in a healthy, safe relationship, cortisol levels remain relatively low and stable. But when someone is in a relationship with an emotionally volatile or manipulative person, cortisol levels spike. Cortisol is released when there is threat or uncertainty. And here is where a particular pattern becomes dangerous. The intermittent reinforcement pattern, sometimes called the cycle of abuse or the trauma bond cycle. In this pattern, the person experiences periods of extreme attention and affection, high dopamine and oxytocin, followed by periods of withdrawal, coldness, or criticism. The withdrawal creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates cortisol release. The nervous system enters a state of vigilance and anxiety. Then, when the attentive and affectionate period returns, it feels like intense relief. The person experiences a rush of reward chemicals as the threat resolves. But because this cycle repeats, the nervous system becomes addicted to this rhythm. It is chemically similar to addiction. The person is craving the relief they get when the withdrawal ends, not realizing they are dependent on the person who caused the withdrawal in the first place. This intermittent reinforcement pattern is one of the most powerful psychological phenomena in human relationships. It is used intentionally or unintentionally in countless relationships. A person gives sporadic attention to keep their partner chasing them. A boss praises work inconsistently to keep employees striving. An advertiser shows you an appealing image occasionally, so you keep engaging with the brand. The unpredictability creates a neurochemical pattern that is incredibly difficult to break. The brain becomes hooked on the unpredictability itself. Add to this the phenomenon of love bombing, a term that describes the early phase of a relationship where one person showers the other with extreme attention, affection, and idealization. In love bombing, dopamine and oxytocin are released in extraordinarily high quantities in a very short period of time. The person being love bombed experiences a state of neurochemical euphoria. Everything feels perfect. Everything feels possible. The person's brain has been flooded with so much reward chemical that they literally become unable to process threat information clearly. They are not stupid. They are not naive. They are neurochemically altered. For people who have experienced loneliness or rejection, love bombing can feel like a salvation. If someone has spent years without genuine connection, or if someone has been told repeatedly that they are unlovable or undesirable, then suddenly being the object of intense affection and attention can feel overwhelming. The neurochemical state can be so powerful that it overrides basic skepticism. The person thinks, finally, someone sees me. Finally, someone values me this much. I cannot let this go. What the person does not realize is that the intensity of the love bombing is not a measure of genuine care. It is a measure of dopamine and oxytocin flooding. It is a neurochemical state that is often unsustainable and is frequently followed by a significant downswing. The tragedy of love bombing is not just that it feels incredible. The tragedy is that it resets the person's baseline for what they think they deserve after the intense early phase. Even when the person becomes less attentive, the person being bonded may still perceive the normal level of attention as special, because it is more than they had before the relationship started. Additionally, the contrast between the intense love bombing phase and the normal phase creates a longing to return to the intensity. The person begins to do things to try to recreate the intensity, often becoming more accommodating or more willing to overlook concerning behaviors. There is another piece to this neurochemical puzzle: the role of past trauma and conditioning. If someone grew up in an environment where love and attention were inconsistent or conditional, their nervous system has learned to expect this pattern. When they encounter someone who provides this pattern, intense connection followed by withdrawal, their nervous system recognizes it as familiar. On a deep, non-conscious level, the pattern feels like home. This is not because the person is damaged or broken. It is because the nervous system has been shaped by past experience. A nervous system that was trained to expect love to come with uncertainty and volatility will sometimes seek out this pattern even when healthier alternatives are available. Furthermore, the nervous system of someone with past trauma is often dysregulated. Their baseline cortisol might be chronically elevated. They might be in a state of low-grade anxiety or hypervigilance, even in safe situations. When such a person encounters someone who offers intense attention and affection, they experience relief. For a moment, the anxiety quiets. The nervous system finds a strange kind of peace in the familiar pattern. This is why trauma survivors often find themselves in relationships that repeat the patterns of their trauma. It is not because they want to be hurt. It is because their nervous system was trained to find that pattern familiar. And familiar feels like home. Loneliness itself deserves its own discussion in terms of neurochemistry. When someone has been lonely for an extended period, their brain enters a protective mode. Cortisol remains elevated. The person becomes somewhat hypervigilant, but also increasingly willing to accept connection from any source. The desperation for connection actually alters the threshold for what the person will accept. Someone who would normally recognize certain behaviors as red flags might overlook them when lonely, because the alternative, returning to a state of isolation, feels worse than the risk. All of this neurochemistry creates a perfect storm. The person meets someone attractive or compelling. Dopamine and oxytocin begin to flood their system. Their perception narrows. Their skepticism decreases. If the person is also lonely or has past trauma conditioning them to expect inconsistent love, the vulnerability increases further. If the person they are meeting is manipulative or emotionally volatile, they are likely to engage in intermittent reinforcement or love bombing, further amplifying the neurochemical hijacking. The result is that the person's own biology has been turned against them. The systems that were designed to protect them have been chemically overridden. This is not something that willpower can overcome. It is not something that intelligence can overcome. It is biochemistry. And this is the crucial point. Understanding this is not an indictment of the person. It is a description of how the human nervous system works. It is a reminder that when people miss red flags, it is often not because they are incapable of seeing them. It is because their neurochemistry has been altered in ways that make seeing them extraordinarily difficult. Chapter 5. How manipulators exploit your brain. The tactics, understanding. The neurochemistry of attraction is only half the picture. The other half is understanding how people who are manipulative or emotionally exploitative use this knowledge, whether consciously or instinctively, to bypass the brain's protective systems. These are the tactics. These are the specific behaviors that keep the alarm system silent and keep the person trapped in a cycle of missing red flags. It is important to note that not all manipulators are consciously aware of the neuroscience of what they are doing. Some are. Some have learned through trial and error exactly which behaviors trigger dopamine and oxytocin in their targets. Others simply have developed patterns of behavior that work for them, and they repeat these patterns because they get results. Either way, the effect is the same. The manipulator, through their actions, is essentially hijacking the target's neurobiology. The first and most obvious tactic is love bombing. in the early stages of attraction or relationship formation. The manipulator showers their target with attention, affection, compliments, and idealization. They text frequently. They arrange to see the person often. They remember small details about the person's life and reference them later in ways that suggest genuine care and attention. They suggest that the person is special, different from anyone else they have known, uniquely valuable. They create an intensity of connection that feels almost dreamlike. What is happening neurochemically is that dopamine and oxytocin are being released in quantities that the target has probably never experienced before. The target's brain is being flooded with chemicals that say, "This is the most important thing in the world right now." The prefrontal cortex quiets down. The amygdala's warnings become background noise. The person is essentially in a state of euphoria. This is not something the person imagined or constructed. This is happening in their brain. The problem with love bombing is that it is unsustainable. At some point, the intensity decreases. The manipulator either loses interest, becomes comfortable enough that they stop the performance, or simply cannot maintain the energy and attention that love bombing requires. When the intensity decreases, the person experiences a significant drop in dopamine. They begin to crave the return to that state of euphoria. They may start trying to recreate the love bombing by being more accommodating, more available, more willing to compromise their boundaries. The manipulator, noticing this, can now operate from a position of reduced effort while maintaining control. The person is now chasing the high that the manipulator created in them. The second major tactic is intermittent reinforcement. This is the unpredictable pattern of reward and withdrawal that was discussed in the previous chapter. The manipulator is attentive and affectionate sometimes, withdrawn and cold other times. The unpredictability keeps the target in a state of psychological vigilance. When will the attentive version of the person return? The uncertainty itself becomes addictive. What makes intermittent reinforcement so powerful is that the brain's reward system is more responsive to unpredictable rewards than to predictable rewards. If someone receives a reward every time they perform an action, the brain's response eventually plateaus. But if someone receives rewards unpredictably, the brain remains in a heightened state of anticipation. Variable rewards are more addictive than consistent rewards. This is the principle behind slot machines. It is the principle behind social media platforms that show content unpredictably. And it is the principle behind relationships with people who offer affection and withdrawal in unpredictable cycles. The impact of intermittent reinforcement on the brain is significant. The person begins to attribute the manipulator's withdrawal not to the manipulator's nature or intentions, but to their own performance. When the manipulator is cold, the person thinks, "I must have done something wrong. If I improve myself or change my behavior, they will return to being warm." This is not irrational thinking. This is the brain responding to the actual pattern it is observing. The problem is that the manipulator's withdrawals are not actually responses to the target's behavior. They are a deliberate tactic. But the target has no way of knowing this. So they keep trying, keep adapting, keep hoping that if they just get it right, the person will return to being the warm, attentive version of themselves. The third tactic is what is sometimes called gaslighting, the systematic denial of reality and the manipulation of perception. The manipulator will deny things they said or did. They will suggest that the target is misremembering or being overly sensitive or paranoid. They will insist on their version of reality even when the target has clear evidence that contradicts this version. The effect is that the target begins to doubt their own perceptions. They begin to trust the manipulator's version of events over their own memory and observations. This tactic works because it directly attacks the target's ability to use System 2 reasoning. System 2 needs reliable data to function. It needs to be able to trust that what it observes is real. When the manipulator systematically calls into question whether the target's observations are real, the target's ability to use analytical reasoning becomes compromised. The target can no longer trust their own data, so they defer to the manipulator's interpretation of reality. They become dependent on the manipulator to tell them what is real and what is not. Gaslighting also exploits the phenomenon of cognitive dissonance reduction. If the target believes, "This person loves me," but the manipulator's behavior contradicts this, the target experiences cognitive dissonance. Rather than questioning whether the person loves them, the target often resolves the dissonance by questioning whether they are interpreting the person's behavior correctly. They tell themselves, "Maybe I am being too sensitive. Maybe I am misreading the situation. Maybe this is normal, and I am just not used to it." The manipulator, by persistently denying reality and insisting on their interpretation, reinforces this process of self-doubt. The fourth tactic is what could be called selective sharing. The manipulator reveals personal information and vulnerabilities selectively to create the illusion of intimacy and to create a sense of obligation in the target. When someone shares something vulnerable with you, you often feel obligated to reciprocate with your own vulnerability. This is a normal and healthy dynamic in genuine relationships. But the manipulator exploits this by sharing vulnerability strategically. They reveal just enough to create the impression of intimacy, but not enough to actually be known or truly vulnerable. Meanwhile, they have encouraged the target to reveal their own vulnerabilities, insecurities, and secrets. The target now feels emotionally intimate with the manipulator, but the manipulator has retained a significant advantage. They know the target's vulnerabilities, but the target does not truly know them. This tactic works on the neurochemical level because vulnerability triggers oxytocin release in both parties. When someone shares something vulnerable with you, oxytocin is released in you, and you feel bonded to them. When you share something vulnerable with someone, oxytocin is released in you, and you feel bonded to them. The manipulator can engineer a situation where both things happen frequently, creating high levels of oxytocin without actually reciprocating genuine vulnerability. The result is that the target feels deeply bonded to the manipulator, while the manipulator maintains distance and control. The fifth tactic is isolation. The manipulator, often subtly, creates distance between the target and other relationships. They may criticize the target's friends or family. They may suggest that the target's time with others is time away from the relationship. They may create situations where the target must choose between spending time with them and spending time with others, and they respond with coldness or criticism when the target chooses others. Over time, the target's social support network shrinks. They become increasingly dependent on the manipulator for emotional connection and validation. Isolation is particularly powerful because it removes the target's ability to reality test. If the target is in regular contact with friends or family, those people can sometimes notice inconsistencies or concerning patterns. They can offer alternative interpretations of events. They can provide evidence that contradicts the manipulator's version of reality. But when the target is isolated, they have no one to turn to. They have no outside perspective. Their only source of information about what is real and what is right is the manipulator. This makes them vastly more susceptible to gaslighting and to maintaining beliefs about the relationship that are not based in reality. The sixth tactic is what might be called intermittent accountability, the occasional acknowledgement of wrongdoing without genuine change. The manipulator will occasionally apologize for their behavior or acknowledge that something they did was wrong. But the apology is not followed by actual change in behavior. The same problematic behavior repeats. However, the fact that the manipulator occasionally acknowledges wrongdoing creates a cognitive framework where the target can believe that the manipulator is self-aware and capable of change. This belief, combined with hope that the next time will be different, keeps the target invested in the relationship despite the pattern of broken promises and repeated behavior. What is happening here is that the occasional acknowledgement of wrongdoing releases dopamine in the target. It feels like progress. It feels like hope. The target thinks they understand what they did wrong. Maybe this time they will actually change. The brain, in its addiction to hope, overlooks the clear pattern that change is not happening. System 2 reasoning would notice this pattern and conclude that the person is not changing. But System 1, operating in a state of dopamine release and hope, focuses on the emotional validation of the occasional apology rather than the factual reality of the repeated behavior. The seventh tactic involves exploiting the target's past trauma and insecurities. If the manipulator learns that the target has experienced rejection or abandonment in the past, the manipulator can use this knowledge to control the target through threat of abandonment. If the target has internalized beliefs that they are unlovable or undesirable, the manipulator can exploit these beliefs by occasionally confirming them, making the target more grateful for any attention or affection the manipulator offers. If the target has a history of shame around something, the manipulator can weaponize this by threatening to expose or judge the target for these things. This tactic works because it operates on the target's deepest wounds. It activates old pain and old survival mechanisms. If someone was abandoned as a child, the threat of abandonment can trigger a panic response in the nervous system that overrides all other considerations. The target will agree to almost anything to avoid this feared outcome. The eighth and final tactic is what might be called performance of change. The manipulator creates the appearance of change or effort without actually changing. They might engage in therapy or read books about relationships or talk about their commitment to being better. But beneath this performance, the problematic behaviors continue. However, the performance itself releases dopamine in the target. The target sees the evidence of effort and interprets this as genuine change or genuine care. The target becomes invested in supporting the manipulator's journey of growth. But the journey never actually goes anywhere. What all of these tactics have in common is that they work by exploiting the brain's natural neurochemical systems. They work by keeping dopamine available while minimizing cortisol and blocking oxytocin to anyone outside the relationship. They work by creating uncertainty in a way that the brain finds compelling. They work by exploiting past trauma and conditioning. They work by making the target's own perception unreliable so that the target cannot accurately assess what is happening. None of this means the target is weak or stupid or damaged. It means the target is human, with a human brain, and that human brain is being systematically exploited by someone who understands, consciously or not, how to trigger specific neurochemical responses. It means the target's own biology has been weaponized against them. And here is the crucial point. Understanding these tactics is the beginning of freedom from them. Once a person understands how their brain can be hijacked, they can begin to notice when it is happening. They can begin to create distance between the hijacking attempt and their response to it. They can begin to ask themselves, Is this response coming from my authentic self? Or is this coming from my brain in a state of neurochemical alteration? This awareness is the first step toward rebuilding a relationship with your own amygdala and your own wisdom. Chapter 6. Practical Tools to Train Your Brain. How to hear your signal again. Understanding the problem is not enough. Understanding the neuroscience of why your alarm system goes silent, why dopamine overrides wisdom, why manipulators are so effective at their craft. All of this knowledge is essential. But knowledge alone does not protect you. Knowledge does not rewire the nervous system. Knowledge does not change patterns that have been reinforced for years or decades. What changes things is practice. What changes things is taking the understanding of how your brain works and translating it into concrete, actionable techniques that you can deploy in real time, in the moments when it matters most. The tools I'm about to share with you are not theoretical. They are based in neuroscience, but they are also field-tested by people just like you who realized their alarm system was being hijacked and decided they wanted a different outcome. These tools work because they interrupt the automatic processes that lead to blindness. They create space where System 2 thinking can emerge. They strengthen the connection between what your amygdala is sensing and what your conscious mind is able to perceive and act on. Let me start with the most foundational tool, and I want to show you exactly how it works by introducing you to someone whose life changed the moment she put it into practice. There is a woman I want to tell you about. Let's call her Sarah. She was 45 years old, and she had been single for 5 years. Not lonely in the way that everyone experiences loneliness sometimes, but deeply lonely in a way that had become part of her identity. When a man appeared in her life, intelligent, seemingly attentive, genuinely interested in her thoughts and her past, something shifted inside her. He remembered details she had mentioned in passing. He sent her songs that he said reminded him of her. Within 2 weeks, he was suggesting they were soulmates, that he had never met anyone like her. Sarah's dopamine and oxytocin levels were likely soaring. Her amygdala, which should have been cautious, was completely silenced. Then around week 3, something changed. His responses to her messages became slower. He canceled plans twice without much explanation. When Sarah expressed that she had been looking forward to seeing him, he responded by suggesting she was too attached too quickly and that she needed to work on her independence. Sarah's body registered this shift immediately. Her amygdala sent warnings, but her brain went into defense mode. He is right, she told herself. I am being too intense. Everyone goes through phases. He probably just needs space. Her conscious mind did exactly what it was designed to do in situations like this. It protected the narrative she was invested in. But Sarah had learned about a tool called deliberate pause. This is the practice of interrupting the automatic response in moments when you are most vulnerable to poor judgment. When you are attracted to someone, when emotion is high, when your brain is in System 1 mode and wants to move toward connection, you introduce a pause, a moment of stopping, a moment of reflection. This pause does not need to be long. Even 48 hours can be transformative. In those 2 days, the acute neurochemical state begins to settle. The dopamine high diminishes. Your prefrontal cortex becomes more active. You become capable of thinking with a clarity that was not available to you in the moment of emotional arousal. So Sarah committed to a 48-hour pause. She did not text him. She did not call. She did not analyze every word he had said, trying to understand where she had gone wrong. She simply waited. And as the hours passed, something shifted. The urgency decreased. The shame decreased. And with that decrease came clarity. What had felt like a personal failing started to look different. During this pause, Sarah engaged in what is called red flag journaling. She opened a document and wrote down exactly what had happened, with as much specificity as she could manage. Not vague impressions, but concrete facts. Week 1. He contacted me every day. Multiple texts, songs, suggestions that we were special together. Week 2. He invited me to see him repeatedly, texted frequently, suggested we were soulmates. Week 3. His responses slowed down. He canceled plans. When I expressed disappointment, he told me I was being too attached and too needy. When she read those words back to herself, the pattern became visible in a way it had not been before. This was not a sign of her failure. This was a deliberate pattern. Love bombing followed by criticism and withdrawal. The moment Sarah documented these events sequentially, something remarkable happened in her brain. By writing them down, she had created an external record that her brain could not rationalize away. She could not convince herself that the pattern did not exist because she had the documentation right there. And with that external anchor to reality, Sarah's confidence in her own perception returned. Then Sarah asked herself what I call the 3 questions. The first, what did he actually do? Separate from his explanation of why he did it. She answered, he love-bombed me intensely in week 1 and 2, then suddenly withdrew and blamed me for the intensity he created. The second question, if my best friend told me this story, what would I think? She sat with that question for a moment. She knew exactly what she would think. She would think her friend was being manipulated. Is there any interpretation of this behavior that would be concerning, even if I am choosing not to believe that interpretation right now? Yes. This looks like a deliberate pattern designed to create confusion and self-doubt in me, which would make me more willing to accommodate his wishes and adjust my boundaries downward. That clarity changed everything for Sarah. She did not end the relationship immediately. Patterns are complex, and pulling away from someone you have bonded to neurochemically is not easy. But she began to notice. She documented his behavior. She asked these 3 questions repeatedly. She became aware. And that awareness, that simple act of beginning to perceive what was actually happening, was the beginning of her reclaiming her own nervous system. Now, the next set of tools involves learning to trust what your body is telling you. Your amygdala sends signals not just to your conscious mind, but also to your entire body through the nervous system. When something in a situation is off, your body often knows before your thinking mind does. The nervous system tightens. The breath becomes shallow. There is a sensation of contraction in the chest or the gut or the throat. There is a quality of unease that cannot quite be articulated in words. Many people have been trained to ignore these signals, trained to prioritize logic over sensation, to not be difficult, to give people the benefit of the doubt. Relearning to trust your body's wisdom is an essential part of recalibrating your threat detection system. This is called somatic awareness, and let me introduce you to another person who learned this the hard way. Her name is Lisa, and she was in her late 40s, in a relationship with someone who was gradually isolating her from everyone she loved. It started subtly. Her partner would make small critical comments about her best friend. She seems kind of selfish, the way she always brings conversations back to herself. When Lisa made plans to see her sister, her partner would become withdrawn and distant, making Lisa feel guilty for leaving him. Over the course of a year, Lisa's social circle shrank to almost nothing. She was spending nearly all her time with her partner, and she was becoming increasingly dependent on him for validation and emotional regulation. She felt lonely even while being in a relationship, but she could not understand why. What Lisa eventually learned to notice was what her body was telling her. Before she would see her friends, her nervous system would tighten. Her breath would become shallow. There would be a sensation of anxiety in her chest that she had learned to interpret as a sign that she was being selfish and should probably stay home. But one day, someone suggested to her that these physical sensations might not be guilt. They might be her nervous system registering that something was wrong with the situation itself. Lisa began to check in with her body with real attention. She noticed that when she was with her partner and he was being cold or critical, her nervous system contracted. Her breathing became tight. Her shoulders tensed. These were not random sensations. They were signals from a nervous system that had been trained to expect punishment for asserting her own needs. The practice of somatic awareness involves periodic checking in with sensation. When you are with someone, or even when you are thinking about someone, pause and notice. Does your body feel open and at ease, or does it feel contracted? Is your breathing flowing naturally, or is it shallow? Is there warmth and expansion in your chest, or is there tightness? When you speak your truth, does your system feel congruent, or does it feel like something within you is resisting? These sensations are not random. They are signals from a nervous system that has been shaped by millions of years of evolution and by your own personal history. Your body is constantly assessing whether this situation and this person feel safe. By bringing conscious attention to these signals regularly, you begin to develop a working relationship with your nervous system's intelligence rather than dismissing it as anxiety or paranoia or selfishness. Lisa began to notice something striking. Whenever she spent time with her partner, her body registered danger. And whenever she started spending time with friends and family again, despite her partner's withdrawal, her body slowly began to relax. This was information. This was her nervous system telling her that isolation was being used against her, and that reconnection was healing. A third tool involves what might be called reality documentation. This is keeping a written record of facts about the person and the relationship. Not interpretations or feelings, but facts. They said they would do X. What actually happened? Y. They promised Z. When did they follow through? When did they not? Over time, this creates a document you can consult. When your brain is in a state of idealization and is tempted to rewrite history in a more charitable direction, this documentation serves as an anchor to objective truth. This tool is especially crucial if the person you are involved with engages in gaslighting, because gaslighting deliberately erodes your confidence in your own memory and perceptions. This is something that David, a man in his early 50s, learned about through painful experience. He was in a business partnership with someone he believed he could trust. They had agreed on specific financial practices. But over months, his partner began operating differently, claiming they had never discussed certain arrangements. When David tried to reference their earlier conversations, his partner would become defensive and insist that David was misremembering or being paranoid about money. David's gut told him something was wrong. He had clear memories of these conversations. But his partner's confidence in their contradictory version created doubt in David's mind. David's history was relevant here. His father had frequently told him he was remembering things wrong, and those messages had left a mark. When his partner engaged in gaslighting, David's old wounds activated, and he began to question his own perception. He was vulnerable to the manipulation precisely because his nervous system had been primed by early trauma to distrust its own data. But David made a crucial decision. The moment he noticed the discrepancies, he began to keep records. Not accusations, just facts. October 15th. Discussed payment schedule with partner. The agreement was that invoices would be paid within 30 days. December 3rd. Partner claims we agreed to net 60 terms and acts confused when I reference our October conversation. By creating this documentation, David created an external reference point that his brain could not rationalize away. He could not convince himself he was misremembering because he had the documentation right there. And with that external anchor to reality, David's confidence in his own perception returned. He was able to address the situation from a place of clarity rather than from a place of self-doubt. A fourth tool is what I call the compassionate observer perspective. This involves mentally stepping outside of your situation and watching it unfold as though you were a caring friend observing someone else's life. The observer is not critical or judgmental. The observer is compassionate. But the observer is also objective. You can ask yourself, if I were a devoted friend looking at this person's relationship, what would I notice? What patterns would I see? What would concern me? Why would I be concerned? This practice leverages a truth about human nature. We often have better judgment about other people's situations than we do about our own. By adopting this observer perspective deliberately, you access your own wisdom without the distortion that comes from being emotionally embedded in the situation. This is a tool that Lisa also discovered, though she approached it differently. She imagined her best friend in her situation. What would Lisa think if her friend told her that every time she wanted to see family or friends, her partner became distant and critical? Lisa knew exactly what she would think. This is a pattern designed to control and isolate. And there it was. By stepping outside of her emotional involvement in the relationship and looking at the pattern as though it were happening to someone else, Lisa could see what her emotionally entangled self could not see. A fifth tool involves deliberately cultivating and maintaining relationships and activities beyond the person you are evaluating. Isolation is one of the manipulator's most powerful strategies. Counteracting isolation is one of the most powerful protective strategies available to you. By maintaining relationships with friends, family, and community, you create multiple perspectives on your situation. You create people you can reality test with. People who can notice patterns you might be missing. You create a nervous system that is not entirely dependent on one person for regulation and validation. When Lisa made the decision to reconnect with her sister and her friends, despite her partner's withdrawal, something crucial shifted. Every time she spent time with people who loved her and saw her clearly, those relationships provided a counterweight to the isolating dynamic in her primary relationship. Her sister would notice things Lisa was not seeing. Her friends would reflect back to her how different she seemed. These outside perspectives became like mirrors that helped her see the reality of her situation. Lisa also noticed something important. Every time her partner responded to her spending time with friends by becoming cold or critical, her body registered it as information. This is what unsafe looks like, her nervous system seemed to say. This is what happens when you reclaim your autonomy. A sixth tool is what I call the time test. Notice whether the person's promises and claims hold up over time. Someone may promise that they will change a problematic behavior. The question is not whether they promise to change, but whether, months later, they have actually changed. Pay attention to patterns across months, not across weeks. Sometimes people genuinely do change. But the pattern of change promises without change behavior is one of the most reliable indicators of manipulation. And you cannot see this pattern in real time. You can only see it by stepping back and looking at the trajectory over time. The seventh tool involves recognizing when you are rationalizing and interrupting the process in real time. When your brain is tempted to rationalize away concerning behavior, to explain it away, to minimize it, to find reasons why it makes sense. You can pause and ask, am I rationalizing right now? What am I trying to believe about this situation? What evidence supports that belief? What evidence contradicts it? Am I choosing the interpretation that feels most comfortable? Or am I choosing the interpretation that is most accurate, given the evidence? By becoming aware of the rationalization process as it happens, you can sometimes interrupt it and choose a different response. An eighth practice involves regularly questioning and updating the narrative you have constructed about the relationship and the other person. What story have you been telling about who this person is and what your relationship means? Is that story accurate? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? What would the story look like if you did not have emotional attachment to the person? What would an objective outside observer conclude? This tool helps you recognize when you have developed a narrative that is protective or self-soothing, but not accurate, and it helps you gradually move toward a more accurate understanding. A final tool that is perhaps most important involves working directly with your nervous system through somatic practices. Practices like conscious breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, and mindfulness meditation can help regulate an overactive nervous system. When your nervous system is dysregulated, flooded with cortisol, and in a state of hypervigilance, it cannot think clearly. It cannot perceive safety, even when safety is genuinely present. By engaging in practices that calm and regulate your nervous system, you create a physiological state in which System 2 thinking can emerge, and in which you can feel enough safety to assess threat accurately. One specific technique that is simple but profoundly effective is called box breathing. The practice is straightforward. Breathe in through your nose for a count of 4. Hold that breath for a count of 4. Breathe out through your mouth for a count of 4. And hold empty for a count of 4. Then repeat. This rhythm activates the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the part of your nervous system associated with calm, rest, and digestion. When your nervous system is in parasympathetic dominance rather than sympathetic activation, your body feels safer, and your mind becomes more capable of clear thought and accurate perception. These tools work because they are based on an understanding of how your brain actually functions. They do not ask you to ignore your emotions or to distrust your feelings. They ask you to create the conditions under which multiple parts of your brain can communicate with each other. They ask you to interrupt automatic processes long enough to have a choice about how you respond. They ask you to gather data and to trust what that data shows you, even when it contradicts what you wish were true. What all three of these people, Sarah, David, and Lisa, discovered is that their amygdala had been right all along. The red flags were there from the beginning. Their nervous systems were detecting something real, but without tools to bridge the gap between what the nervous system was detecting and what the conscious mind could perceive and act on. They were walking in circles. They had the signal, but they could not hear it clearly enough to trust it. Once they had the tools, everything changed. Sarah saw the pattern. David reclaimed his memory. Lisa recognized the isolation. Their own wisdom, which had been there all along, became audible and actionable. Chapter 7. What to do when you are in it, right now. A practical guide. There is a moment when understanding the theory ceases to matter as much as action. There is a moment when someone sits in the midst of a relationship or a situation where something feels profoundly wrong, and all the neuroscience in the world becomes abstract. This chapter is for that moment. This chapter is for people who suspect something is off, but cannot quite name it. People who sense manipulation but are not certain. People who are wondering whether to trust their own perception or whether they have lost their mind. What follows is a practical roadmap. not advice given by an expert from a distance, but a description of what tends to happen when people begin to gather data about their situation instead of drowning in confusion about it. The first recognition that tends to emerge is this: the fact that someone is asking the question at all means something. The nervous system has sent a signal. It may be confused, it may be competing with other signals, it may be difficult to articulate. But it is there. This is where everything begins. Not with certainty, but with a willingness to acknowledge that something in the body or the mind is saying, wait, pay attention to this. From this starting point, what emerges as most helpful is a practice of documentation. Not clinical documentation or record-keeping designed to prove something to someone else, but rather documentation for oneself. A situation journal, a daily or thrice-weekly record of what it feels like to be with this person or to interact with this person. What is the emotional state afterward? Is there clarity or confusion? What happens to sleep? Can one think straight, or does the mind become foggy? What happens to the body? Is it relaxed or tightened? What shifts in one's own behavior? Does one feel like oneself, or does one feel like someone performing a role? These are the entries that populate the journal. Not drama or crisis documentation, but the quiet, ordinary observations of what it actually feels like to move through this dynamic. As this documentation accumulates, something interesting happens. Patterns become visible that were not visible in the moment-to-moment confusion. And patterns are information. Patterns tell a story that emotional experience alone cannot quite articulate. Alongside this documentation, there is another practice that proves invaluable. Most people who sense something is wrong experience intermittent clarity. There are moments, perhaps the morning after a difficult interaction, perhaps when alone and not receiving messages, perhaps when in the presence of someone trusted, when the situation becomes suddenly, startlingly clear. In those moments of clarity, before the confusion settles back in, there is something powerful to do. Write a letter. Write it as though one is speaking to one's own wisest self from across time. I see what is happening. I know you love this person. I also know that you have lost yourself. Here is what I see. Here is what concerns me. Here is what I want you to remember when you lose clarity again. This letter becomes an anchor. It becomes a voice that can be consulted during the fog. The next layer of this work involves bringing one person into the circle of awareness. Not everyone. Not one's entire social network. One person. Someone who loves unconditionally and who will tell the truth even when it is not what one wants to hear. The practice is to tell this person what has been happening, and then to listen without defending, without explaining, without trying to convince them that things are not as bad as they sound. Just listen. What does this person notice? What does this person see that one might be missing? This external observer becomes a crucial mirror, someone whose perception has not been altered by the neurochemical state one is in. Now, over the next 2 weeks, a sequence of practices begins to consolidate. The first is somatic awareness. 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, evening, one pauses and notices the body. Not emotionally or psychologically, but physically. Right now, in this moment, does the nervous system feel safe or does it feel on alert? Is there relaxation or tension? Is the breathing easy or constrained? What is present? This gets written down. Just the observation. By the end of 2 weeks, a clear picture emerges. The nervous system does not lie. It is registering something. The question becomes whether that something is real danger in the present or echoes from the past. Simultaneously, Every time something happens that feels concerning or confusing, the three questions get asked and written out. What did this person actually do, separate from their explanation? If a best friend told me this story, what would I think? Is there an interpretation of this that would be concerning even if I am choosing not to believe it? The act of writing forces precision. It prevents the brain's natural tendency to smooth over the rough edges and protect the narrative one is invested in. During this same period, there is another crucial element: the maintenance of other relationships. If the person one is with becomes cold or withdrawn or critical when one spends time with friends or family, this is critical data. If spending time with people who love you results in punishment or distance, this is information. Notice it, document it, and notice what the body feels after spending time with people who see you clearly. Does the nervous system feel more regulated or less? This is also information. At day 15, something changes. One full day alone. No contact with the person. No checking their accounts or scrolling through their messages. One full day with oneself and one's journal and one's letter from clarity. One reads everything that has been documented. One sits with the patterns that have emerged. One reads the letter written during a moment of clarity. And then, from that place, one asks the hardest question. If I removed all emotional attachment to this person, what would I conclude? If I was not hoping for a particular outcome, what story would these facts tell me? If someone I deeply cared about presented me with this exact situation, what would I tell them to do? This is the moment where clarity emerges. Not certainty. Certainty is rare and often illusory. But clarity. A knowing about whether this is a situation of active manipulation or whether one is in a relationship where both people are trying and difficulty is coming from one's own past. A knowing about whether to step back or whether to step in with new tools and new awareness. If the documentation has revealed a pattern of deliberate manipulation, the path that unfolds is one of extraction. This does not mean leaving immediately. Extraction from a neurochemically entangled dynamic is often a gradual process, but it means beginning. It means slowly spending less time with the person. It means prioritizing the relationships with people who love one's actual self. It means beginning to make plans and pursue activities that do not include this person. As this happens, a response typically emerges from the person one is pulling away from. They often intensify their efforts. They offer more attention or more criticism. This is not a sign to stay. This is a sign that the assessment was correct. A healthy person does not intensify their efforts to keep someone who is trying to leave them. A person using manipulation does. If, conversely, the 2 weeks have revealed something different, if they have shown that the person is genuinely trying, that concerns have other explanations, that one's own nervous system was being activated by one's own past rather than by present danger, then the work becomes different but equally important. The work becomes one of healing one's own nervous system, of distinguishing between signals that carry present information and signals that carry historical echoes, of potentially seeking professional support to work with this distinction in a deeper way. But here is what people in both situations discover. They are not broken. If they have been manipulated, they are not stupid or naive. They were hijacked by their own neurobiology by someone who understood, consciously or not, how to activate it. If they have been reacting to their own past, they are not paranoid or damaged. They are human. Their nervous system was shaped by their history. There is a path forward from either place. For those extracting themselves, what unfolds is a period that is genuinely difficult. The nervous system has become dependent on the other person for regulation. Taking that person away creates a gap. There is depression often. There is anxiety. There is a desperate urge to go back, just to make the discomfort stop. This is not a sign of failure. This is withdrawal. It will pass. And as it does, as weeks become months, the nervous system begins to find its own stability again. This is the time to lean into every relationship available. Calls to friends, time with family, support groups, therapy. Every moment with people who love clearly is a moment not in the state of desperation that might lead back. For those who recognize their own past trauma being activated, the work is one of professional healing. A therapist who understands nervous system work, somatic practices, the gradual recalibration of the nervous system's threat assessment so that it can distinguish between the past and the present. Regardless of which path someone walks, there is one practice that shifts what happens at the neurological level. Box breathing. 5 minutes every single day. In for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4, repeat. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the system associated with calm, clarity, safety. After 30 days of this practice, the baseline anxiety has decreased. Sleep has improved. The mind is clearer. These are the signs that the nervous system is recalibrating. And here is what becomes visible to people who move through this process with honesty and courage. They discover that they are not crazy, that their nervous system is not broken, that their amygdala has been working the entire time and sending signals that deserve to be heard. Clarity does not arrive as lightning. It arrives as an accumulation of small recognitions that unfold across days and weeks. One day sleep becomes slightly better, almost imperceptibly. But there it is. Then a full hour passes without the obsessive replaying of conversations, without the constant checking and rechecking. A week later, time with friends begins to feel nourishing again rather than guilt-inducing, and the body registers the difference. 2 weeks in, there is a subtle shift in the quality of the breath, a relaxation in the chest that has been tight for months. A month later, looking back from this vantage point, there is a trajectory visible, a person becoming clearer, more grounded, more recognizable as themselves. This transformation happens because someone decided to trust their own nervous system, because someone had the courage to gather evidence instead of ignoring it, because someone honored the wisdom of the amygdala that had been trying to speak all along. The path is not simple. It requires sitting with discomfort and uncertainty. It requires grieving what is lost while simultaneously celebrating what is reclaimed. It requires time and support and sometimes professional help to rewire what has been deeply conditioned. But the path leads somewhere real. It leads to a nervous system that knows its own signals and trusts them deeply. It leads to a life where love is not confused with addiction, where connection is chosen rather than compelled through neurochemical manipulation, where the person one becomes is the person one actually is, rather than the person one has learned to perform for survival. This transformation is available. This is what emerges on the other side of honest inquiry. This is what waits when someone finally learns to hear what their body has been trying to tell them all along.